And just to kind of get an idea, when you have thousands of people show up during a feast weekend, they're bringing in their offerings, and most people that come in are not farmers or not herdsmen or cattle, or work with cattle. So what they're doing is when they come in, they're purchasing what's there with the exchange. And some people are foreigners, they're coming from overseas, and then you have people that live in the land. And so literally, if you're taking a dollar amount, I mean, you're talking millions of dollars are changing hands on these tables. In that time, shekels, drachmas, denarius. Money's changing hands in the thousands. And so they had a system set up to handle it, even at Mount Sinai, to deal with all of this stuff. So to keep an idea, when you start looking at this, whenever man touches money, there's always a possibility for corruption. And what usually kept the corruption at bay generally was the fact that you had good high priests. When you had a solid high priest that was running the temple, then they controlled that whole process. When the high priest corrupted himself, like we saw during the days of Eli and his sons, that's when you got corruption in the system. When you saw the first century, the same thing happened. So we're going to take a look at some of that today. We're going to look at the Mishnah and read some of the understandings and how these things were when it was transferred. So let's look at a shekel. A shekel was the currency of Israel from the very beginning. It was done in silver. It's called shekel or shekalim, which is plural. And the Akkadian, it was siklu or sikulu. The units of weight or currency, they based it based on weight. So when you figured in the weight of silver is how you figured out what something was. The first usage from Mesopotamia was around 3000 BC. Initially, it may have been referred to a weight of barley. This shekel was about 180 grains, 11 grams, or 3.5 troy ounces, which is British measurement. Okay. So this is in the first century. This was found in 68 AD when they began minting. When they revolted, they began minting their own coins again. And this is what it looks like, the coin they found just a couple of years ago. If you can see on the coin, you see what? Two things. You see a pomegranate, right, on one side. On the other side, you have a cup of wine, which is a reference to the drink offerings. Okay. Now, they just minted the half shekel in Israel about a year ago, or 2 years ago. And this is what it looks like today. So now when the Sanhedrin stands up and they can start accepting the half shekel as we speak, from what I understand. So they can begin accepting it. So you and I can make offerings with the half shekel. Now, what does the half shekel represent? It's basically how you figure out, it's how you did a numbering or the census of the people in Israel. So that's what that looks like. So let's look at this. Now, the origin of banking dates back probably to the very beginning of man figuring out how to interchange between somebody else. But there's words that we use that we in our language that signify some things that they did, and I want to go into them. The word bank was borrowed in Middle English from the Middle French banque or the Old Italian banca. And if you know Spanish, anybody has any information in Spanish, what is a banca? It's a bench. Okay, that's where that word comes from. So a bench would be set up, people would come to that bench, and there would be exchange of currency and money. And just about everybody here, who's never flown outside the country? Okay, if you've ever flown outside the country, the first thing you do is you go to a bench and you take your currency and you exchange it with somebody else. Sometimes it's a window, or you go to the park, and generally in South America, every major park, there's money changers with bags, and they will change your dollars for soles or pesos or whatever the currency of that country is. So benches were used as desks or exchange counters during the Renaissance by the Florentine bankers, who used to make the transactions atop desks covered by a green tablecloth. There comes the idea of the money, the currency being green. Greenback. One of the oldest items found showing money changing activity is a silver Greek drachma coin from the Hellenic colony of Trapezus on the Black Sea, modern Trapezoid, and from 350 to 325 BC, presented in the British Museum of London. So this is a long time ago. They got a coin dating back that far back. The coin shows a banker's table, trapeza laden with coins, a pun on the name of the city. In fact, even today in modern Greek, the word trapeza means both a table and a bank. A table and a bank. So it's got some implications, right? So where the system starts off, we go to Exodus chapter 30, verse 11. It says, Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, When you tally the sum of the children of Israel, in other words, when you take a census of the children of Israel, by numbering them, that every man must pay a ransom for his soul to Adonai when you count them, so that no plague will fall upon them. Everyone among them who crosses over must give a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel, which is 20 gerars. And 20 gerars is a weight measurement. That's how we understand about that's based on a weight, if you will. A half shekel is an offering to Adonai. Verse 14. Now everyone who crosses over among them who is counted from 20 years old and upward is to give the offerings to Adonai. So how a census is taken basically is, when we take a census, if you're 20 years old or older and you're a man, you're going to give a half shekel, and that would go to the temple treasury. Okay? If you're 17 and 18, even if you're on your own, you're 17 and 18, you're not giving it. And there's going to be some exclusions, who can, who cannot. It says the rich are not to give more, and the poor are not to give less than a half shekel. When they present the offering to the Adonai, they make atonement for their souls. It's mentioned twice in the scripture verse. You're to take the atonement money from the children of Israel and give it for what? The service of the tent of meeting, or the service of the temple, the tabernacle. So that it may be a memorial for the children of Israel before Adonai to make atonements for your soul. So from that half shekel, and I answer your question here, from the half shekel, the entire operations of the temple would run from that half shekel. So if you have 600,000 men in a census, right, and each gave a half shekel, you have 300,000 shekels, and all of that's to run and do everything. Replace things, modernize, to build, to replace things. You have veils to replace, all kinds of things that are going out of the half shekel. Yes, sir?
How often is that collected?
Once a year. Once a year, yes. And there's going to be different types of collections. This will be done once a year, and there's going to be the wave offerings or the heave offerings, which are going to be done 3 times a year. We'll talk about that here in a minute. You had another question.
You said every man who crosses over, is this an area in the temple where women aren't allowed? Is that
Yeah. Well, no, it's just they're not responsible for the household. So it's the covering of the household, the father or the husband. He is responsible for that. He's a man who would go to war. Okay?
So would he offer for the people in his household? Like
That's what he's doing. Yes,
Okay.
that's how it's been figured. But the census were never to figure out how many people were in Israel. That was never the point. The figure was to find out who goes to war, so we understand how the temple is going to be maintained. And so the factor really is not about, let's count 650,000 people. The main purpose is to understand how it's going to be supported and can it be supported. That's really the key behind it. The other part of the scripture verse is that it's a low enough currency that it's not going to be a pressure on a poor person, and it won't be, and to a rich person, it doesn't make them think that, and they're not allowed to give a 1 cent more. In other words, they can't give a full shekel. They can only give a half shekel. So they can't flaunt themselves. It's not about that. It's not about showing, look, I've got a lot of money, let me put it down. Now, you can pay, we'll find out in the Mishnah, you can actually pay the tax for somebody else. They don't have the means, you can pick up their tab. In other words, you can pay their half shekel. All right, but every man is responsible for their own tax. All right, so then we come to the scripture verse in Matthew 17, which is really interesting because a lot of people read this and don't understand the meanings behind it. So let's give you an example. It says in Matthew 17, verse 14, when they came to Capernaum. Now, let me just, before we read the whole scripture verse, who does not know where Capernaum is? Okay? All right, let's go show you a picture of Capernaum. All right, that's the synagogue at Capernaum, and it sits right there on the Galilee. Okay? And this is really important when we talk about later on. Its position in the land is key to understanding why Matthew 17 is being told here. So let's go back to the scripture verse. It says in Matthew 17, verse 24, when they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the temple gods came to Peter and said, your teacher pays the temple tax, doesn't he? It's a question. Now, why would they ask that question? That's part of it. That's part of it. But it's really to find out if they're being included in the census. It's to understand, are they doing the responsibility? So there's a lot of aspects going on here. It's also a test. They're testing him, okay, to find out if this guy really is what he says he is.
So compliance test.
Yes. Now, what this is not, this has nothing to do with the Romans. Absolutely nothing to do with the Romans. Okay, this is exclusively because people have read into this. This is completely about the life of the temple and supporting Israel, okay, in Judea. Now, when Peter came into the house, Yeshua spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? The kings of the earth, from whom do they collect tolls or tax? He says, from their sons or from strangers. Now, after Peter said, from strangers, Yeshua said to him, then the sons are free. But so that we do not offend them, go to the sea, throw out a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you'll find a coin. Take that and give it to them for me and for you. Okay? So he's going to take whatever currency. Now this seems like it's a wild story, but
It's got to be a shekel.
it has to be a shekel. It can't be a Roman coin. It has to be a Tyrrhenian shekel, like we showed you the picture earlier. So literally, this was a supernatural miracle behind this, because he catches, and there's it. But he's pointing to us. He says, we're going to keep our obligations as part of being the son of Israel. We're going to keep our obligations. At the same time, I think it's showing the supernatural aspect that God controls the money, not men. So let's back away. So why was there a collection point at Capernaum? That's the question a lot of people ask. Because this is supposed to go to the temple service, all of it. Why would you have a collection point in Capernaum?
It's a port,
What's that?
port area.
Port area has a lot to do with it. But when Israel came into the land, they said they had, initially, how many Levitical cities did they have initially? I think they had 3 initial on one side and 3 on the other side. Okay, so the total was 6. And then they grew. And as a
Let's say the side. What are you talking about?
So 3 on the east side of the Jordan and 3 on the west side of the Jordan. Okay, so they set up the Levitical cities. Now these Levitical cities were places of refuge, but one of the most important things, they were a collection point for the tithes. The first fruit, the first tithe, the second tithe, and the third tithe was all collected at these points. So they had Levites in these cities to be part of the collection. Levites also inside the temple, inside Jerusalem, they would be part of the collection. So this is not a priest's duty. This is the duty of just the Levites. And so Capernaum, as you said earlier, was a collection point for the first tithe, the second tithe, the third tithe, and also the half shekel, the census, for the census as well.
Because of its location in relation to those 3 places.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've got several apostles that are from the city. And later on, the Romans actually, I was reading this week, the Romans actually take Capernaum and they build on it, and they just discovered. So what's interesting, they just discovered the city. Now it's they discovered where Capernaum is. They saw where the Romans had built on it and made it even a larger city. And so this was kind of an important place that was we find in Scripture. That's cool. Now, thus we see 3 major functions of the money exchangers in ancient Judea. First, they were at those ports of call, like you said earlier, as for doing foreign exchange. So if you came from Parthia, and you came through Capernaum, you came down the King's Highway, and you came across, you would have your foreign currency of Parthia, and you would take that foreign currency and you would do a transfer. You would change that currency into the local currency. Second, when they would travel, and we'll read this earlier, when they travel, they would take, like you and I would go, if I were to go overseas, so I don't have to take a stack of ones, I'll have all hundreds, right, in my pocket. And I'll exchange $100 when I go into, say I go to Israel, I'll take a $100 bill. I'm not taking 100 $1 bills. And so just like that, they would take major currencies so they could exchange. And so they break large denominations into smaller ones. And the third is served as a banking center for all of Israel. Okay, this is really the beginning. And I had a little conversation with Gunnar that from the very beginning, Israel has been involved in these type of currencies. Let's go back to the time of Egypt. We saw Joseph handling the exchange between land and the grain, right? We see later on that the northern kingdom in Tyre, the Phoenicians, they controlled a banking system. And in Babylon, many of the Jews that were involved in the banking system there. So they've always had a tie into the currency and the market exchange and the banking. So this is not something new. It's pretty much something they've done a very long time. Now, while all these functions are of interest to students of economics and numismatics, there is a special attention paid to the fees charged to the change of foreign money into the Tyre shekel and half shekel acceptable for payments due to the Jerusalem temple. Now, I don't think there's coincidence, but as an example, and you read in Ezekiel that the city of Tyre controlled the foreign market. If you go back in Ezekiel 27, you read how people brought their wares. One nation would bring their blankets, another would be their camels, and other people would bring these wares. And they would always come to Tyre, which was a center location, and they do these exchanges. And what we read in extra biblical material is that in Tyre they would have unbalanced scales, and they would control those unbalanced scales. So if you, Rudy, showed up with $100, for example, and you needed the equivalent of what would be 100 shekels, I could change the scales on you because I control the center point. And this leads credence to corruption and usury, okay? So in this place, the Tyrrhenian shekel, which is interesting, was basically minted from the very beginning of the same place. There was always a foreign exchange there, right? Now I'll show you this. If you ever have a chance to go to the land, this is one of the places you want to visit, because this could have very well been one of the synagogues that Yeshua got up and read in, because he would have been in these towns. Okay, so as you see it, as it was in that day, 2,000 years ago, and there you can be able to see on the Sea of Galilee. All right. So then we read this in Mark 11, and this is probably one of the most famous verses about corruption in the temple that you'll find, and it's in connection to Passover and the and coming of Yeshua into Jerusalem. But we read in Mark 11, verse 15, they came to Jerusalem, and Yeshua entered in the temple and began to throw out those who sold and those who bought in the temple, and overthrow the tables of the money changers and the seat of those who sold the doves. Now, the question I've heard pastors say that they had an illegal setup. They should have never been doing these things. They should have never had these tables in the temple, and that's completely false. Okay? Those tables were supposed to be there in the temple. They were supposed to be doing the exchanges. Because if you were, let's say, you were, say, a fisherman, you sold your wares, you came in, you're not bringing animals or grain with you, so you would take the money you have and you'd pay your temple tax, or you'd pay your tithe, and there would be somebody at these tables that would do the conversion for you. So those tables were supposed to be there. Okay, that's been the big people misconstrued it. They said, well, they should have never had these tables there in the first place. They were supposed to be there.
So they're there all the time?
They're there all the time, and they've been there from the very beginning. There was always a table. Even in the tabernacle at Mount Sinai, they said there was Levites responsible for this that set up, and they would. It was a collection point, is what it was. Okay. Let's keep going. It says in verse 16, he would not allow anyone to carry a container through the temple. He taught, saying to them, "Isn't it written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations?" And this quotes from Isaiah 56:7. But you have made it a den of robbers, quoting from Jeremiah 7:11. Now, what's very interesting about that, and I'll get you a question here, is remember we talked about a few weeks ago when Peter and John come up and says, silver and gold I have none? All right, so the location of this is just below those steps, okay? It would be in the area of the Ophel, somewhere in that area. So they've gone in there and done some archaeological digging, and they found where they're basically see how that wall is behind you? It'd be three-sided. It's made out of stone, and they would set a table inside those, basically what we would call a cubicle, if you will. That's what it looked like. And they had these cubicles of stone set up all along their tables, and they would rent those places. We're going to talk about the rent here in a minute, because this is where the high priest would get them. They would overcharge, or they would charge too much, or they could raise the rent based on certain situations. All right, so but those were always there. Yes, sir.
Where is that from?
I'm sorry, where's the location?
Yeah.
So, if you look at the Temple Mount, okay, as you go down toward the pool of Shiloah, toward the city of David in that direction, it would be between the mikvah pools down the pool. As you came up, and they would be there, and then on the, you know where the western wall is today? They were in the western wall. That's where most of them were.
Okay. So the western wall was actually a support structure for a berm that held Anatolian fortress. So where was the temple from there?
We'll talk about that another time, but we'll get to that afterwards because we've gone through that. That's so the thing is where is the temple location, and we spent several weeks going through that. But and we're going to get into specific locations. But that teaching, okay, that's being put out there. There are many videos, a lot of YouTube stuff. As we've gone through it, it didn't take into account a lot of things. Yes, they found some stuff there, but without digging deep into that, that is actually not the location of Fort Antonius, and we'll talk about that, at a later time. But I'll show you here in a minute. All right. So when you look at the house itself, you look at the temple building. If you can look up this, let me just kind of point here. You can see where the facade, the face of the temple would be right there, and in front of it is what's called the mizbech, or the altar, right? And then you have four major buildings. Up at the top left is the Beit Otzrot, which also is called the House of the Trees of Lebanon. Okay, Now, what's important about that location, that's where the treasury kept. All the tithes and all the money and everything was kept. That's where it's housed, so you know that's a specific location. On the other side, you have, or down south here, you have where the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin was, Beit Avtinas, when we talk about that. The House of the Spark is over here, and then you had another major building on the fourth side. But all four, these are the four major buildings. Of those four major buildings on the temple, the House of the Treasury was on the closest to the western wall. Okay, which is interesting because it's closer to the western wall, and that location is where they had the money changers were set up. All right, so there's been corruption from the very beginning. We read here in Jeremiah, before the destruction of the first temple, we read this in Jeremiah 7:11. Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers in your eyes? Look, even I have seen it. It is a declaration of Adonai. So the Lord is saying back in the time of roughly 605 before Common Era, He's saying that there was already corruption had already gotten there. You go back before King Saul, there was corruption at that point. So it had come back just before the fall of the temple, and then before it fell again, there was another corruption in it.
And that's what I was going to ask. When did they start keeping this in the temple like that, like having booths, basically?
From the very beginning, there's always been a place. It's always been there. Yeah. All right. So this is where we kind of understand how the first century corruption got into it. But Annas is one of the high priests, also known as Ananias, son of Seth. All right. He's from 23, 22 BC. His death date is unknown. Probably they think somewhere around 40 Common Era, 40 AD. He was appointed by the Roman legate Quirinius as the first high priest of the newly formed Roman province of Judea in 6 AD. Just after the Romans had deposed Archelaus, the ethnarch of Judea, thereby putting Judea directly under Roman control. Now, why this is important is because the first time in history the Roman gets control of the province, and they now decide who's going to be high priest. They're going to find a guy who's closest to them, and as far as mindset, beliefs, etc. Yes, sir.
Did Herod appoint priests before that in Rome, basically? They were actually not. They were the Edomites, actually, as Herod was.
There's actually nothing written down in the Mishnah that says that. I'm going to give you the lineage here in a minute. And so everybody that's in the lineage in the Mishnah it's been Jewish. Now there is a possibility there was a shadow high priest. It's very possible that he put people that had influence.
There were still sons of Abraham, but they weren't.
But there would have never been non-Jew. There would never been. It's always been a Cohen. It has always been a Cohen, or they would have revolted. Right. So they could have had a shadow. They could have had something that was a shadow, but they would have always had a Cohen in the position of high priest. Annas was a Cohen. Okay. Caiaphas was a Cohen. What he wasn't was a son of Pinchas through Eleazar. He wasn't in that line. Remember, there's this specific, because they would give him, there's a covenant of peace, a covenant of salt was made with that line, and they were to always be the high priest. Where Itamar, okay, would still be a Cohen and still have functions in the temple, but they could not become a high priest. So it is very possible that Ananias and Caiaphas were descendants of Itamar, but they were not sons of Pinchas, but they were Cohens. Okay? Now, Ananias officially served as high priest for 10 years, from 6 to 15 AD, when at the age of 36 he was deposed by the procurator Gratus for imposing and executing capital sentences which had been forbidden by the imperial government. What does that mean? Well, the Romans said only we can do capital punishment. So all stoning and everything else, that if anything that took place, it had to be done in private. And they caught him doing probably some type of capital punishment, and he was fired. But even being fired, he never left, his presence never left the temple. So it's either him, his son-in-law, or his sons would govern for the next 20, 30 years. They would always be in the high priest position. I'm going to show you that record here in a second. But they always had a shadow over the priesthood, all the way until it was destroyed. All right, so here's an example of. So we find Ananias, son of Seth. He reigned from 6 Common Era to 15 Common Era. And then we have a son of Ananias, Eleazar. He reigned. He's there in the high priest position for 2 years, 16 and 17. And then we have his son-in-law, and we all know his son-in-law. He's probably the most famous from John chapter 18:13, we have Caiaphas, who was from 18 to 36, 37. We believe that he stood into power there. Now, there may be times where he would step down, but for the most part, that was his. He covered that entire period. And then we have another son of Ananias, Yochanan. We have Theophilus, and I always wondered this, just something that popped in my head, right? Because Gunnar and I were talking about this today, because you know that Luke wrote his two books in Scripture. He wrote to a Theophilus, right? What is the chance? We don't know. I can't prove it. Nobody can prove it. But what's the chance that Theophilus that he wrote to was one of the sons of Ananias? It's quite a possibility, because we know that the language of the book of Acts and the language of Luke is 100% about the temple, centered around the temple, and language of the temple. So here we got a guy who serves from 37 to 41, which is after the death of Yeshua. He's serving Theophilus, and then you can see, you look at the first verses of Luke and Acts, you got a Theophilus. Then we got Mattathias ben Ananias, which served in 43 for a year, and Ananias ben Ananias, another son, Ananias, served in it. So you have a lot of children and grandchildren now serving in the high priesthood that were not supposed to be, because they were not descendants of Pinchas. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about this, just real briefly about places, so you can understand about locations. But if you bear with me here, if you can look at, see, when you're orienting yourself, you can see where the Wilsons are. So this would be east here, okay? And down here you have the double gate. I'm sorry, yeah, that's correct. You have the double gate over here, and that would be coming up from the south. And you see, we know this is the Huldah gate. There's the double and the triple gate. Remember we talked about that a few weeks ago? All right, so on the south side, that's where Peter and John would come up and say, silver and gold I have none. They're coming up from the lower city, which is where the Ophel and the city of David's down here. And they're coming up going up the ramp right there. And today you can still see the locations of the triple gate and the double gate are still there. They've just been covered up. Okay. In other words, when I said you can still see the arches, but they've been filled in by stonework. Okay. So then you've got, and what's important, this I want you to capture this. Okay, when you come up into these gates, you're going to go up and you got the royal stoa on this side, and then you got Solomon's colonnade would be on the east side. Now in the Solomon's colonnade, we know that's where all the teaching took place. Okay. Now the final where money was taken from those exchanges to the Levites who would take it into the treasury was done right here on the royal stoa, right near the triple gate. Okay, you follow me? That royal stoa, you're going to read about this in the Mishnah. I'm trying to get to these locations so you don't get lost here. That's an exchange point with currencies coming from those stalls where the money changers is going to go to the royal stoa. That's kind of like the place where they collected everything and then they put it in the treasury. Okay? And then you have obviously the temple itself, and then you've got Fort Antonius over there on the north side near the Pool of Israel. All right, so let's go into the Mishnah Tractate Shekalim. Now, why are we talking about this? Because we're talking about the half shekel. So we're going to use the Mishnah. We're going to read from it, so you can draw some understanding of how the corruption crept into the laws. Okay, but here it says in chapter 4, verse 9 of the Mishnah Tractate Shekalim, it says, once every 30 days they fixed prices for the shekel chamber. Let me say it again. They would fix the price every 30 days. So obviously, there's always been inflationary periods to this very day. There's always been. So they would set the price. Okay? Now, if you lived in the Galilee, or you lived in Tyre Sidon, or you were in Cyrene and you're doing a pilgrimage, you have no idea what the price has been set at. Okay? You save all year to do your pilgrimage, because that's part of the second tithe. So your second tithe you used for your pilgrimage, when you get there, you don't realize, you don't have any idea what that set price is. Okay?
What would happen if you were short?
They don't explain the Mishnah, but if you're short, then you'd have to borrow it somehow from somebody. Okay? You're not gonna be able to make the full tithe. Okay? So whoever undertakes to provide the flour. So what does that mean? So there was somebody. So if you're going to do a grain offering, say Gunnar and his family are going to do a grain offering. All right. So you go to the point, whoever's providing the flour, okay, and you take your currency and you go in and make the exchange for the grain offering. Okay? Then that grain offering would be put into bowls or into vases, jugs, and they would be carried into the temple, and then that's from there where the priest would take that, and then they would do the offerings, okay? So he says, right, whoever undertakes to provide the flour at 4 seahs a selah, a coin. If the price stood at a deflated to 3 selahs for a seah 1/3 of an ephah, still must provide it at 4. So if there was deflation, you still have to pay 4. Okay, you'll see why they do this in a minute. If he undertook to provide it at 3 to a seah, 1/3 of an ephah, at the price stood at an inflated, so let's say when inflated to 4, okay, let him provide it at 4, for the claim of the sanctuary is always paramount. You need to underline that. Whatever it's set for that 30-day period, that's prominent. It doesn't matter if it's inflation or deflation. Once something's set, that's what you pay for that, okay? And that's the way it was designed to be. So in other words, to keep corruption from getting in, and people saying what the price was and why the price wasn't, we set a price, people know about it, and everybody comes and they pay that price, right? That's the best way to do it. And if you have a stable economy, then there's really no fluctuation at all. That's what it's always going to be. All right, so let him provide it at 4. For the claim of the sanctuary is always paramount. And if the flour, now listen to this, and if the flour got wormy, and the wormy flour it comes out of expense. Whose expense? The Levites. The guy that was managing the flour exchange, it would come out of his own pocket if it got spoiled. So he had to pay no matter what, and he had to come up with the extra. You're going to see this time and time again, where the Levite had to make sure that things were set. Once it was established, he had to fulfill his obligation. You see how a high priest can come and take advantage of this, okay? So I know this might be a little boring, guys, but you've got to understand, how does corruption get into this? I'm trying to paint a picture for you so you know the operations of the system, okay? Now, if the flour got wormy, the wormy flour is at his expense. And if the wine turned sour, the sour wine is at his own expense. And he does not receive his fee until after the altar has effected his acceptance. So until after the offerings has taken place, then he'll get paid for what he is. So he doesn't get a penny for it. So this the Levite is making a huge commitment. He's got to come up, and he's got to be able to stand behind his name. All right? This is why, in the first century, you got to hear this real quick. This is why these guys decided to move the price at the tables. Okay? They didn't want to eat the expense. I don't blame them, but it's not that the law, the oral law is that he had to cover his own expense. So there was a fairness to the people, not necessarily a fairness to the Levite. All right, so Leviticus 25:35. If your brother has become poor and his hand can't support him among you, then you shall uphold him. As a stranger and a sojourner, he shall live with you. Take no interest from him, prophet, but fear your God, that your brother may live among you. Verse 37. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him food for profit. Now, when you read this, let me ask you a question. Can you loan at interest if they can afford it? Yes. That's been a misconception. It's always been a misconception that you can't loan at interest. It's only the person who can't afford it you can't put usury on. Okay? And it also can't be exorbitant. There's got to be regulations behind it, because you can charge somebody into poverty. But the key here to this verse is you're not to take advantage of the poor. If it costs you whatever, let's say $10, then you charge them $10 if they can't afford it. And how do you know this? Because it's an understanding. When they're doing that, when they're doing their census, you kind of know where somebody's at. All right. So let's look at the shekalim tax during the time of Yeshua when he entered the temple. Let's take a look at that and see how kind of that affected. Now, I'm going to go through the Mishnah, and the reason why we're reading each one of these tractates in the Mishnah, because they wrote extensively about this system. Okay? So chapter 1, verse 1 is on the first day of Adar, and for you and I, that would be somewhere in the February-March time frame. And Adar would be considered the last month of the Jewish Hebraic calendar, because the next month would be Aviv. And what happens on Aviv? Or Nisan? What happens on Aviv or Nisan? What happens on Nisan? Aviv or Nisan? The scripture says Aviv is called Nisan today. What happens on that month? You guys got to know this. It's important. We celebrate it once a year. It's one of the major feasts. It is, say it's Pesach, Passover. There you go. So before we get into the feast season, okay, in the month of Adar, the last month, okay, another way of saying it, before we get into, let's say, Thanksgiving, November, in the month of October, there would be a preparation here. So on the first day of Adar, February or March, they make a public announcement concerning payment of shekels due and concerning the sowing of mixed seeds. And we read that in Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22:91. On the 15th day of that month, they read the Megillah, that's the scroll of Esther. They would read Esther in the walled cities, and they repair the paths, the roads, and the immersion pools, and they care all public needs, and they mark off all the graves, and they go forth to inspect the fields on account of the mixed seeds. So what are they saying? In other words, you're getting ready to have 250,000 to 300,000 people pour into Jerusalem. So the month prior, they would do all the preparations and the remodeling and the rebuilding to make sure everything could handle, the mikveh pools could handle this infusion of thousands of people. Okay? All of this would take place, you can see here, before Passover. Now we read in verse 3 of chapter 1 in the Mishnah. It says, on the 15th of that month of Adar, they set up money changers' tables in the provinces. So first they would get everything cleansed up and built and set up. Then the money changers would go be put into place, because people would be started coming earlier. Now this would also include the money tables, the exchange rates would be done in the Levitical cities. They would set them up at that point as well. Okay, it's always, so what happens in Jerusalem would happen in Capernaum as well. So on the 25th of Adar, they set them up in the temple. Once they were set up in the temple, they began to exact pledges from those who had not paid the tax in specie. From whom do they exact a pledge? And you keep in mind, anytime, let's say for example, David, you say, what's your dad's name?
Caesar.
Okay, I'm David, son of Caesar from Bethlehem or Bethlehem, and you say I'm paying for my house, and you give it, and then your name at the tables. When you pay the shekel, they would take your name and put it in the book, and you'd be registered. Okay, and let's say that Monty came with you. What's your father's name? Mac. So you say I got with me Monty, son of Mac. And he's from let's say Bethany, and he's coming with me, and I'm going to pay for him this year. Okay, and you write down. That's what happened at these exchanges. Okay. Now, what's interesting is Levites, Israelites, proselytes. It's people sojourn who grafted in, proselytes, and freed slaves, but not from women, slaves, or minors. Any minor who's on behalf of the father began to pay their shekel does not again cease to pay. In other words, if you would pay, if you're an Israelite, like if someone's proselyting, is grafting in or becoming part of Israel, if you were just freed, in other words, you came to the Jubilee and you were given freedom, then you would pay. But before that point, you're still indentured, you would not pay before that period of time. Okay, you're still under obligation, so you couldn't pay. And they said, on behalf of the father, begin to pay the shekel, does not again cease to pay. And they do not exact a pledge from the priests. The Cohens would not pay. Okay? Now what they would do is because they still had to do a census for the Cohens. You realize that, right? Because you go back in the book of Chronicles and we look at Numbers, they still did a census of them. So if they're not responsible to pay, what would happen is they would pay for them. They would cover their costs, which is kind of cool. For this, and they said, and they do not exact a pledge for priests for the sake of peace. Now let's go to the Kalbon. Now this took me a while to figure this out, but it's pretty simple, and this is how the corruption got in. Okay. Right now, if you look on your phone, and who wants to go to Mexico, let's say tomorrow, does anybody know the exchange rate of Mexico right now? Okay, the best way to explain what the Kalbon is, there's a rate that you pay to buy, and there's a rate that you pay to sell, right? Buy a stock, there's a buy price and a sell price, okay? The difference between is described in Hebrew as a kalbon. We would call it a tax, a levy, a tariff, a fee. All those are proper words. But a kalbon is the fee that you charge for the exchange. Now when you read Scripture, Scripture never tells you to charge a kalbon, ever, okay? So how the kalbon, or how that extra tariff got in, is because they needed to cover the change in the exchange rate from Parthians and Cyrenians and people coming from Asia Minor. They covered the exchange. But who set that rate? It's not like today, it's all digital and we got boards and keep track of it. When you came in there, it was basically, they figured it out and they would charge the difference of the exchange. And this is where the problems came. It was in the exchanges and the exchange rates. Even to this day, I'll give you an example. I'll go to the, whenever you go, just as an example, anybody who goes to an airport, never exchange your money in an airport exchange rate. because you always get a lesser rate. But if you go to the money exchangers in a town or a city or at the park, you're going to get a better rate. But at the airport, you always get a lesser rate. They take a portion more. It happens there. So this is the same thing. So let's read this. This comes from the Mishnah Art Scroll edition, chapter 1, verse 6. And then these are liable to the surcharge: Levites, Israelites, proselytes, and freed slaves. So who had to pay the temple tax? The same people. Who had to pay the surcharge? Same people. All right? But not priests, women, slaves, or minors. He who pays the shekel in behalf of a priest, woman, slave, or minor is exempt from the surcharge. That's interesting. So you would come in there and to not be charged the kalbon, you could pay for somebody else who's not obligated. You pay for them, and then they would exempt you from the kalbon, the surcharge. So you pay exactly what it was supposed to be. Okay. And if he paid the shekel for himself and for his fellow, this is interesting. Now, this is a difference. They wrote a different thing in the law here. He is liable for a single surcharge for himself. In other words, if Monty, son of Mac, okay, and I'm going to pay for Monty, son of Mac, right, and Robert, son of Kenneth is going to come in there, I'll pay for you. I have to pay the kalbon, the surcharge for mine, but because I'm paying for somebody else who can't afford it, they alleviated that, that was good, okay? Now you say, well, what do I need to know all this stuff? Well, I want to know why corruption gets in, and I understand what Scripture says, and I want to see the big picture, because we got a temple that's going to get rebuilt very soon, and trust me, there's going to be, the half shekel is going to be presented, there's going to be tithes coming in, but these kalbons are going to come back. And if there's not a fair high priest who manages properly, that stuff will get in there and they can basically corrupt it. Chapter 1, verse 7, he who pays a shekel as a gift for a poor man, for his neighbor, or for a fellow townsman is exempt. But if he lent the money to them, he is liable. Fair enough, right? So if I loan it to Monty, son of Mac, then I'm still liable for the surcharge from the tithe of the cattle. But when they are liable to the tithe of the cattle, they're exempt from the surcharge. And how much is the surcharge? And then it goes into it. And actually, this is a real extensive study on how they figure this out. But a silver ma, a ma is a coin valued at 1/12 of a shekel. Okay, what would be a half shekel? 6/12. So it'd be you have basically 6 mas would be a half shekel, right? 1/24 of a selah. The words of Rabbi Meir says, and sages say a half of a silver ma. A ma coin value at 1/12 of a shekel. Now this can be kind of boring as some of these things we get into, but it's really interesting how they figured out these surcharges.
Just, can I say something?
Yes.
Okay, so if, say, a half shekel is $1.25, $1.25, then you go to pay a half shekel, you have to pay $1.25 plus another 25 cents.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So just keep in mind, and I'm going to end up with a story that's really interesting. In an archaeological find, they figured out that people accepted the surcharges as a way of life. They didn't rebel against it, and some people would even store away money for the future with the kalbon already taken into account. And I'm going to finish off with this here in a minute. So, money changers charge a small fee in Greek called agio, which is the rabbinic literature is called a kalbon, which possibly is derived from a similar Greek word meaning a small coin. Chapters 2, verse 1 of the same tractate says they charge shekels and darkons because of the burden of the journey. And this is another aspect of it. So what you would do is Rudy's traveling a long ways. He's coming from Beaumont, Texas. He's going to Jerusalem. And so what you would do is you would put in your currency in the highest amount, which we explained earlier, to prepare for the money exchange. When you get there, you come to these exchanges, and then you would take these big currencies and break it down. Not just for your fees and your tithes and stuff like that, but also your living expenses. Because if you're going to go get a hostel instead of a place to stay, you don't have these big currencies. You got to break them down. Same thing would happen today. All right. So townsfolk who sent their shekels, which were stolen. This is a big problem in those days. Townsfolk who sent their shekels, which were stolen or lost, if the heave offerings already had been taken up, the townsfolk took an oath to the temple revenuers, and if not, they take an oath before the other townsfolk, and the other townsfolk pay the shekel in their stead. So what happens? A lot of times, let's say we as a body lived in the Galilee, right? And we're required to do the pilgrimage, okay? But I could only afford to go during Passover. I couldn't go in all 3. So what you would do is you would take your tithe, and those who would be doing the pilgrimage, you give it to them. and they would set them up in these basically, just like in the Old West, the wagon days, right? You would have, like you see those Wells Fargo, wagons. They would put them in these containers, and they would take them in there. But bandits would they'd go after these places because this is money. So just like in the Old West, the same thing would happen then. So they'd have to protect these pilgrimages and the money going with it. So the townspeople, if it got stolen, they would have to go to the revenue and make an oath saying it got stolen from us, and they would hold them to that oath, and they would have to worry about it. So they're going to explain what happens after that. If the shekels were found or the robbers returned them, both these coins paid by the townsfolk and those coins originally put forth are in the status of shekels, and they do not go to their cattle for the coming year. In other words, if they finally found them, it's not like you can take that money and say, okay, well, I'm just going to apply it to the next year. No, that had to be paid out there. Okay? To me, I find this some of this is pretty fascinating to me, because this is a whole way of life that we don't experience, because we don't experience the temple in our life. We don't have the pilgrimages, the 3 times a year. So to us, it's kind of a foreign concept. But when you start understanding they're just like us and they deal with the same issues we do, you can see how these things are put into place. Yes, sir.
That money was already spoken for, it's kind of first fruits type of thing, so it's the same as balance in your checkbook.
Right. You can't say first fruits is for next year's first fruits. Once it's committed, whether it arrives at its point or it's been stolen. Exactly. Similar situations exist in other well-traveled areas of the ancient Near East, where dozens of types of money, weight, standards, and currency systems came together. For this reason, a network of independent money changers evolved. Now, I keep referring to this, if you go overseas, this is normal. In the United States, we use banks, right? But if you go overseas, there's money changers everywhere. All the parks, that's how you know, in South America, in the middle of the parks, that's where you're going to exchange your money. And it's just the way it is. And you figure out who you can trust. And they figure out who they can trust, because a lot of people try to pass off fake bills. But back then, they had exchanges all over the place. A network, so they provided a critical service, especially in Jerusalem when visiting. Jews needed to change their local money into silver coins from Tyre in order to pay their statutory annual half-shekel dues to the Jerusalem temple. Okay, I'm almost done with this part. The Hebrew word for these money changers or exchange bankers is shulchani. Now, what do you think the word shulchan means? Does anybody know? Huh? Table. Shulchan is the word for table in Hebrew. It's a plural, shulchani. So he's turning over the tables of the exchange. That's what they were called. It's interesting that they use that name. They were not only needed to change foreign money into the shekels and half shekels of Tyre for use of the temple, but foreign travelers did not carry large amounts of small change. Instead, they carried money in the largest denominations possible. And therefore, the money changers always served the important functions to breaking these down into small denominations. All right, so I'm going to jump here. What was the purpose? Okay. This is a lot, guys, and I don't want to burn you here. Okay, so I want to read this. Okay. How many people know what a heave offering is? Okay, heave offerings are wave offerings, okay? They're done 3 times a year. They're associated with first fruits. What are our 3 first fruits? We have first fruits of what? What's the first one we have at the beginning of the year? Barley harvest. And then that's when? Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then we have a second first fruits. When does that come? That's right. So it's 50 days later. We have the Feast of Pentecost or Shavuot. And during Shavuot, you give what's called the wheat harvest, the first fruits there. And then in the fall, we have what? A third first fruits. What was done in the fall? Just before the Feast of Trumpets, they would prepare for that harvest, the grape harvest. Okay, so you'd have 3 harvests: the grapes, the wheat, the barley. Those are 3 harvests. Okay, and those would be your first fruits would be given out of those things. And there's other species that would go along with it. But just keep it what they would do is they take your first fruits, and when you cut it, you lift it up and you'd wave it to the Lord. Okay. Now, a lot of times in the fields, this is what people say, well, how do they figure that out? Let's say that you're a farmer and you had 100 acres, right? You would mark 10 acres of your land, and you mark it off when the day you planted, you go and mark off that portion, those 10 acres, and that ought to be set aside. So when you harvested that field and you took it down to the threshing floors, that stuff would be already been set aside. You already knew it beforehand. There was no, all right, do I do this before taxes come out or after taxes come out? Should I do it off the top or the below? No, what you do is you would mark off the trees that you're going to harvest or the wheat field. It's already set aside, and that's how they did it. It's very interesting process. So the people in the land knew they would take their first fruits, and they knew that out of first fruits there would be 3 tithes being paid. Does anybody know what those 3 tithes were? The first tithe would be what? Your annual, out of your annual, what you took out of your annual production. Okay. The second tithe would always be set aside out of that portion. A portion would be set aside for your pilgrimages. Okay. And the third tithe would always be needed in the 3rd and 7th year, okay, for helping the poor and the Levites, etc. So there's always, some people say, well, should we tithe or should we not tithe? And I always say, what tithe are you talking about, right? Because there's 3 tithes, and they all have different meanings. So this is kind of important. So this is what when we read chapter 4, verse 1, it says, as they heave offerings of the shekel chamber, what did they do with it? It says they purchased it with animals for daily whole offerings. So David, son of Caesar, would come in with he would have it bundled up, and he would go to, he either already took it to the threshing floor and already have it put in grain bags, most likely, right? And then you would set those grain bags on your carts, and you'd take them in. When you would arrive in Jerusalem, or you would do this in the Levitical city, because you could do it either or, okay? But you got into Jerusalem, and so you would set the grain bags before them, and then they would give you the currency. You get currency for trading or what have you out of that. Okay, so their drink offerings, wheat for Omer, the first sheaf of the season, which must be harvested and offered to the temple as a meal offering. Only when this is done may the rest of the new grain be reaped. Leviticus 23. Of the 2 loaves of the showbread and all other offerings made in behalf of the community. And there's a lot of offerings. And when you figure all this out, how much do you think people comes out of what they gave on a yearly basis? What did it come out to? You might have a clue? It's close. It's between 20 to 30%, depending on who you were. So this is, now, when you add the king's tax on top of that, that becomes a burden. But this is why God says, I got a fair system. You don't have a king who's oppressing you or making you give anymore. I got a fair system. Now you add the king's tax, or a government's tax, or the city's tax, on top of what you already have to give to the temple. It becomes a burden. People get financially in trouble because of this. So those who guard after the gross of the 7th year receive the salary from the heave offering in the shekel chamber. Rabbi Yossi says, also he who wishes to volunteer may serve as an unpaid guardian or after the gross. They said to him, you too rule the Omer, the first sheaf of the season, which must be harvested and offered to the temple as a meal offering. Only when this is done may the rest of the new grain be reaped. Leviticus 23:10. 2 loaves and showbread derived only from public funds. Now let's get the red heifer. I'm going to show you a picture here. Anybody ever seen that before? Okay, none of you have, right? So in the 1st century and from the earliest times, there was a bridge built across the Kidron Valley. Okay, and that bridge is where they would take the sacrifice of the red heifer would be done on the Mount of Olives. And you could see directly from the Mount of Olives, direct onto the Temple Mount, across east where they come from. Now, what's important is they would also take the scapegoat. Remember, you have 2 goats. One of the scapegoats would be taken across this bridge to the top of the Mount of Olives and thrown off the back end, or released at that point. But that bridge is really important to the story as we get into this here. All right, so in chapter 4, verse 2, the red heifer, Numbers 19:1 talks about the goat which is sent out in the red thread, derived from funds of the heave offering. So where does the heave offering? These are first fruit offerings. They would take the funds from that would be used to build these type of bridges. Okay. The cost of building a causeway for the red heifer, the causeway for the scapegoat, which is sent forth, the thread between its horns, the cost of the upkeep of the water channel, the wall of the city and its turrets, all needs of the city of Jerusalem derived from the residue of funds of the shekel chamber. Coins not taken up with the heave offerings, therefore, Saul says, the ramp of the red heifer, the high priests make it at their own expense. That you see right there. Chapter 4, verse 3 says, as to the surplus of the residue of the shekel chamber, what did they do with the surplus? Could they just give it to the poor? Could they just give it to the poor? Good answer. They purchase it with wine oil and fine flour, and the profit of the resale belongs to the temple. It always had to go back into the treasury. All of that had to go back and stay in the treasury because there's always upkeep. There's constant, those veils wear out. There's stones that need to be replaced. There's enlarging. There's cisterns that are dug. There's water aqueducts that are bringing more water into it. So all this constant building going on. They do not make money in what belongs to the temple or what belongs to the poor. Chapter 4:4. I'm going to finish up here. Okay. Can you see this? I want to go to this here. These are the administrators of the temple. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but if you can see, there's a clan and a family responsible for specific things set in place in the first temple period. So for example, Yochanan ben Pinchas, his family always took care of the seals. And we're going to read something about that here in a second. We got Ahiah, he took care of his family, always was responsible. This was a Levite who was constantly responsible for anything that had to do with the drink offerings. They received it, they checked it, they made sure the process to get to the Cohens was always their responsibility, in and out. Then you have Matthew B. Samuel, he's concerned with the lots. There has somebody assigned to do the lots. You have Petatiah, same as Mordecai. They say that he spoke 70 languages. Very important and interesting. He was in charge of all the burnt offerings. And Ben Ahiah, the son of Ahiah, or the clan of Ahiah, they were responsible for Baal sickness. These were Levites. Now this is what's really interesting about this, is they would eat so much meat, the Cohens would eat so much meat during the Passover that they would get intestinal infections and sick because of the consuming of meat. And so they had a specific family of Levites would take care of their health because they would get sick. So we think, well, that's, how can you eat enough meat? And who's ever picked themselves out at eating so much meat you can't even, you're throwing up, you're sicker than a dog, right? Well, we have a Levite family, that's all they took care of was the sickness of the priest. Okay? Keep on. Then you got Nehumiah, they dug the ditches for water. The Gabinis clan, they were the heralds. The herald was the crier, or the rooster call, right? Then you had the sons of Gibir, they locked the gates, and the crier and the conqueror, they were responsible for both of them. You had the sons of Nebai, they were the nouns. The Ben Azrael took care of the symbols. You have Hugras ben Levi, the sons of Levi were the singers. And they have the house of the garment making the showbread. That's all they did. And then one of the most famous ones is the house of Aptinas. They made it. There was a secret of it. Most of you know that they knew the recipe of the incense, and that family kept it from generation to generation to generation. In fact, one of the buildings of the temple we know is called Beit Aptinas. It's the house of Aptinas. It's where the Sanhedrin is. So each one of these things had a specific responsibility in the process. Now we read in chapter 5, verse 2. They appoint no fewer than 3 revenues and 7 supervisors, and they do not appoint less than 2 people to a public position of supervisor in proper names, except for Ben Ahiah, who's in charge of the Baal sickness, which I referred earlier. And Eleazar, who's in charge of the curtains. Hangings for them did the majority of the congregation except. And let's jump ahead here. Chapter 5, verse 4. He who wanted to purchase drink offering goes over to Yochanan, who is appointed to be in charge of the seals. He pays him the fee and receives the seal from him. He goes over to Ahiah, who is appointed to be in charge of the drink offerings. He hands over the seal to him, and he receives the drink offerings from him. So in other words, it's very simple. Let's say, Rudy, you're in charge of drink offerings. You're in charge of the seals, okay? So I would first come up to your table, and I'd pay out of what I brought with me. I'd pay for what I needed for the seals. Then I go to Rudy and his family, and they ran that stall. They always took care of it. So your family always managed that in perpetuity, right? There's consistency. There's always, they knew, so it would be from father to son would be taught exactly the responsibilities in the temple. Okay? And in the evening, the two came together. Ahiah brings out the seals and receives the money for them. If there was an excess of funds, a little money Yochanan paid out of his own pocket. Remember, the Levites took up the losses. For the claim of the sanctuary is always paramount. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with the story here. I'm going to turn my back to the camera, because I can't read it from that screen. So an elaborate system was put into place, you can see here, but this was an archaeological find that was found. A Jew in the 60 CE built his house, and while finishing it, before its last plaster stage, decided to hide a sacred amount of money in the wall to protect against the evil eye. The most sacred sum of money to the Jews at the time was the half shekel. since this was the amount each man paid to the temple annually, but according to the Mishor, our first century Jews did not want to simply put a single silver half shekel in the wall for luck, since the large number of coins would make a better impression. Okay? Now, the man also decided to put the money into the lamp, a symbol of eternity. So he took the half shekels, but he put a bunch of them and he put them into a lamp, and then he put it into the wall and plastered over it, right? The man, so it says that the man also decided to put the money in the lamp, a symbol of eternity. But wait, a half a shekel was equal to only 128 of the prutot. That's a Roman currency. So when they looked at it, they said, when they found it, it says, so why did the archaeologists find 139 prutots? Because that was the tax fee. He took into account the fee, the exchange fee. He put that inside it because he was going to cover his losses. He was going to make sure he covered both what he was responsible for and what was levied extra. Okay? It says an exchange fee of 2 kabons, kabon on half shekel equals just about 11, adding 128 plus 11, that's exactly 139 prutot. The owner of the house wanted to make sure that when it came to his good luck, every precaution was taken to ensure its accuracy. So, this is a way of life. To us, it's a foreign thing, right? It seems very foreign, but it's very important because to them, they understood how to do it. Now, here's where the problems came in, the corruption. I'll end up here. The money changers were being charged every 30 days, and they would set the price. And so this was putting a huge pressure on the guys at the tables. So the guys at the tables had to do one thing. If Ananias came and says, we're charging you 5 this time, okay? And the standard was 4. Remember we talked about the standard 4 for flour was 4? And he's charging 5. They had to make up the difference. And remember, if there was a loss, like you had the wine went bad or the bread went bad, you had to come out of your own pocket. So what they would do is they would raise that fee there, the kabons, they would raise it up the exchange. And they kept doing this. So month in, month out, you would come on a pilgrimage. You'd come in from Parthia or Cyrene, and you'd show up, and you had saved all year long for this. You'd put away the money, knowing specifically what, because you had Levites in your city that was telling you how much it is, and then you had this corrupt high priest that says, let's set it at 5 this time. Let's put it at 10. And so the guys at the tables they'd have to modify the price to cover those costs. And that's where the problem, that's where the corruption got in. It's because he was pocketing the difference. Okay? He was building himself mansions, big, huge homes, buying fields, doing all kinds of stuff with the money, and making a name for himself, and not taking care of the temple and his responsibilities as a high priest. He was corrupted. And that's what we see why those money tables were turned. Not because they weren't supposed to be there, but because they had corrupted the system completely. All right. Any questions?